It's been a while. I've been hibernating. I often think the only thing that can be done in a British winter is hibernate. I haven't been entirely idle though. I've been working on my short stories, working on a novel, and various other projects which I hope will see the light of day in the next year or so. In fact, those who are familiar with my short story channel, which is called Short Stories for Dark Nights, I think, will be aware that I've been continuing with my short stories throughout the winter period. And for those who haven't actually found their way across there, then I would encourage you to do so. It's where I write and narrate my short stories, which cover a broad spectrum of themes, but which I put a great deal of effort into. And I'd be very pleased to see anyone I'm familiar with, or anyone I don't know but will become familiar with in the future. I'd be very pleased to see you over there. If you find the time or might find it useful. I'm sure you would. Anyway, I'll put a link down below to the channel, hopefully to make it easier for you to make the hop across. The case of Dr. Sam Sheppard is one which I've wanted to do for some time. I've known about it for many years, and I've been studying it over the past few months. And now I've arrived at what I believe to be a condition where I'm able to present it to you with my thoughts on it. These cases are never really completed. They just reach a point at which we as individuals become satisfied that we understand what is happening. I don't think we can do much more than that. My ideas won't please everyone, they won't satisfy everyone, but I hope that many people will find it useful and enjoyable. Anyway, see what you make of it.
It was around 5:40 on the morning of the 4th of July, 1954, when the mayor of Bay Village, Ohio, Spencer Hook, was woken by the telephone ringing. When he picked up the receiver, his friend, Sam Sheppard, was on the line. "My God, Spence, get over here quick," he said. "I think they've killed Marilyn." Spencer Hook roused his wife, Esther, and the two of them dressed quickly and drove over to the house where Sheppard lived with his wife, Marilyn, and their 7-year-old son, Chip. It was now 5:50 a.m. Upon entering the house, whose door was unlocked, they found Sam half sitting and half lying, bare-chested, in a red leather chair in his office, or den, as it was known. He had an injury to his face around his eye, and complained his neck hurt. He had a curious story to tell. He had been asleep on the daybed downstairs in the living room when he heard Marilyn shout, "Sam!" from the upstairs bedroom. He ran upstairs and found someone in the room next to his wife's bed. He grappled with them, and at some point he was knocked unconscious. When he came to, he saw his wife lay dead on the bed, after which he went next door to check on his son, whom he discovered was sleeping soundly. He then went downstairs and saw a tall, bushy-haired man running out of the back door, down some steps leading to the shore of Lake Erie. He gave chase, caught him on the beach, and a fresh struggle ensued, during which, once again, he was knocked unconscious. When he regained consciousness this second time, he returned to the house and called Spencer Hook. Esther Hook went upstairs during Sam's account of events to her husband, and there discovered Marilyn Sheppard dead on the bed, her head battered and covered in blood. Esther returned to her husband in a state of shock and said, "Hun, call the police, call the ambulance, call everybody." Spencer Hook called the police, Sam's brother, and an ambulance. He hardly knew what to make of Sam's story. He offered him a glass of whiskey, which he refused, saying, "No, I don't want that. I have got to think. I've got to think." Dr. Stephen Sheppard, Sam's brother, was quickly on the scene, and Spencer Hook heard him ask Sam, "Did you do this?" "Hell no," said Sam. The Bay Village policeman, Fred Drinken, arrived at 6:02 a.m. and saw the body of Marilyn Sheppard in the bedroom, her face and head heavily battered by a large number of penetrating blows. The bed and pillow were soaked in her blood, which had been spattered liberally about the walls of the room in the ferocity of the attack. Her pyjama top was pulled up and the bottoms pulled down, suggesting that a sexual assault had occurred. Fred Drinken made an inspection of the house. A few items were strewn on the floor in some of the rooms, and Sam Sheppard's medical bag lay open, and its contents tipped onto the hall floor. In the den, several drawers had been removed from his desk and placed neatly on top of each other. Fred was immediately struck by the orderly way in which the apparent ransack of the house had been conducted. It did not have the profligate disorder characteristic of a house robbery, and appeared quite at odds with one that had followed a frenzied, brutal attack on a woman in her home. Nor was anything identified as being obviously missing from the house at this time. 3 guns in the den were not taken, and $32 in a jar was also untouched. The 7-year-old son, Chip, was awakened at 6:30, was groggy, had heard nothing of a disturbance, and was taken away to his uncle's house. Sam Sheppard was also whisked away to hospital, not in the ambulance, but in his brother's car. A famous NFL quarterback, Otto Graham, a friend and neighbor of the Sheppards, called in at the house and was allowed to see the room. He was shocked by what he found and told the press afterwards, whoever had committed the crime had to have been out of their mind. So savage was the attack. It was 8 a.m. when Sam Gerber, the county coroner, arrived at the house. He heard Officer Drinken's account of what he had found at the scene and of the events of the night, and was at once suspicious. There was no visible sign of a forced entry, and little to suggest that there had been a robbery of any moment. It all jarred with the brutality with which the murder of Marilyn Sheppard had been committed. He also learned that Marilyn Sheppard had been 4 months pregnant at the time of her death. Gerber went to Bayview Hospital to interview Sam Sheppard, which he did only briefly because the latter was receiving treatment at the time. The account given by Sam Sheppard was bizarrely given, in vague and almost detached terms. Gerber was convinced that there had been no intruder, and Dr. Sam Sheppard had murdered his wife as a result of a row in the early hours of the morning. Samuel Holmes Sheppard was born in Cleveland, Ohio, on the 29th of December 1923. He was the youngest of 3 sons born to Dr. Richard Sheppard, an osteopath, and his wife Ethel. He attended Cleveland Heights High School, where he was academically proficient and excelled in baseball, basketball, and track, and was class president for 3 years there. He was good enough, athletically, to be offered sports scholarships to several local colleges, but opted to become a doctor, following in the footsteps of his father and 2 elder brothers. At high school, he met Marilyn Reese, and the two began dating. After high school, he enrolled at Hanover College in Indiana to study osteopathy, and then undertook further medical study at the Case Institute in Cleveland, followed by a stint in Los Angeles, where he qualified as a doctor. He married Marilyn Reese in 1945, and a son, Chip, was born in 1947. The couple, along with their young son, subsequently returned to Cleveland, where Sam joined his father's successful practice at Bayview Hospital. Tall, handsome, athletic, and talented, Sam enjoyed many physical pursuits. He and Marilyn were expert water skiers and had a wide social circle in the Bay Village area. They lived in a house on the lake, whose back door led directly to some steps down to the beach. Sam drove an expensive Jaguar XK120 British sports car. All in all, the couple enjoyed the good life in July 1954, until the events of that night ended it all abruptly. An autopsy was conducted by Dr. Lester Adelson at midday, and it was determined that Marilyn had received about 35 blows from a heavy implement and had died as a result of these. Injuries to her hands indicated that she had tried to defend herself and may have fought her attacker. Contrary to police expectations, though, she had not been sexually assaulted. She had died, Adelson thought, at around 4:30 a.m. Initial inquiries by the coroner and investigators had provoked suspicions against Sam Sheppard, and as the investigation intensified, so did the conviction of the authorities that this was a purely domestic matter, and that Marilyn Sheppard had been murdered by her husband. It was learned that the previous afternoon, neighbours Don and Nancy Ahern and their 2 children had been at the Sheppard's house and spent a pleasant afternoon and early evening with them. They lived just 5 houses away from the Sheppards on Westlake Road, and had cocktails and then a roast dinner on the porch, after which Mrs. Ahern locked the porch door. The Aherns then took their children home and put them to bed before returning to watch a movie, Strange Holiday, with the Sheppards. Sam and Don were also listening to the Cleveland baseball game on the radio. Later that evening, Sam became tired. He had had a busy day, and he lay down on the daybed in the living room and fell asleep. He was dressed in trousers and a white t-shirt, and was wearing loafers on his feet. At around midnight, Marilyn had let the Aherns out of the house by the door onto Westlake Road, and they returned to their home. Sam was still asleep at the time they left. Whether or not Marilyn locked this door is unknown, but given that she was shutting up the house for the night, police believed it reasonable to assume she would have done so. Sam Sheppard said he had remained asleep on the daybed downstairs until he heard his wife's scream some hours later. It quickly became apparent, though, that if the doors were, as was believed, locked, then there was no obvious means by which another person could have entered the property. There was no evidence that an intruder had been in the property, other than a less than convincing robbery, which all concerned agreed looked to be staged. A few trinkets, seemingly selected at random, had been discovered in a green bag behind the house, and Dr. Sheppard subsequently claimed that ampoules of morphine were missing from his medical bag. But investigators were unconvinced. Why did an intruder deliver such an unnecessarily frenzied attack on Marilyn, bludgeoning her to death so savagely? And yet a single modest blow, knocking her husband unconscious, apparently satisfied them. It seemed implausible. A detective at the hospital put it directly to Sheppard. "I think you murdered your wife," he said. "No," replied Sheppard. "I loved Marilyn." Search as they might amongst local thieves and felons, or for anyone associated with or seen in the district, there was no one who looked likely. The bushy-haired man Sam had described could not be found. Sheppard was asked to take a lie detector test on the 9th of July, but refused. Naturally, this only had the effect of strengthening suspicions against him. The Cleveland newspapers devoted their front pages to the murder, and were sympathetic to Sam at first, regarding the murder and attack on husband and wife as being the work of a drug fiend. But as more facts emerged, such sympathy rapidly drained away. Sam Sheppard was not a man without connections, even as police struggled to obtain a confession from him concerning the murder. Friends and influential people visited. His family, well known and respected in the community, also sought to place a resolute wall about him, and Cleveland's most noted defense attorney, Bill Corrigan, was hired within hours of the murder. It was clearly a possible line of inquiry that Marilyn had been 4 months pregnant at the time of her death. Apparently, she had told friends that Sam was sterile as a result of working with X-rays, which was why they had only one son. It is not clear whether paternity testing was carried out on the fetus, but in any case, up until the 1960s, such testing could only positively exclude a man as being related to the fetus by means of comparing blood groups. It could not confirm consanguinity. This led to speculation that Sheppard's motive may have been revenge if he was not the father, or suspected he could not be, which might have the same effect. However, it was soon supplanted by another possible motive. Neighbors told investigators that Sam was having an affair with a nurse at Bayview Hospital and was obsessed with her. It didn't take them long to discover her identity. She was an attractive 24-year-old lab technician called Susan Hayes. It emerged that she had been in a sexual affair with Sam Sheppard since they had first met in 1951. A detective put the matter directly to Sheppard on the 10th of July, asking him if he had had a sexual relationship with Susan Hayes. He replied that they were simply good friends. It was, of course, a dangerous lie. On the 22nd of July, an inquest was finally held at Bayview Gymnasium, and Sam Sheppard was subjected to public examination for the first time. He made a poor witness. He gave his stilted and somewhat remote account of a white biped form he had grappled with and pursued, having been knocked unconscious, and which resulted in his being knocked unconscious again. His clothes and body were wet when he was first seen in the house, but he didn't seem to know how he had lost his T-shirt. He again denied, this time in public, and quite emphatically, that he had had sexual relations with Susan Hayes. It has been said his attorney, Bill Corrigan, advised him against any such admission. If this is true, it was a catastrophic error on both their parts to commit to such a lie in the coroner's court, as the revelation of such a lie would be far more damaging than that of any moral transgression which might have occurred. And Coroner Dr Sam Sheppard had not come unarmed. He had evidence of a tryst between Susan Hayes and Sam Sheppard when they had spent a week together in Southern California 3 months before. It was a damning moment. The tide of public opinion now turned against Sam Sheppard. He was an adulterer, he was a barefaced liar, and he was, by that faulty yet inevitable train of logic human beings follow, a murderer. The press was outraged. Here was a man who was clearly the chief suspect in the murder of his wife, yet the authorities appeared to be treating him with kid gloves. The newspaper narratives were well ahead of the curve in this respect, and somewhat perilously the authorities began to do their bidding. There was increasing agitation for Sheppard to be arrested, or at least to be subjected to intense grilling by police. Finally, in late July, he was. He was questioned over a period of 2 days for a total of 22 hours. There was a focused effort to break him, to present him with such an array of contradictions and improbabilities in his statements that he could only confess. He didn't. He repeated the same story, stuck to his account in many respects, attributing changes he made to memory loss. The matter inevitably went before a grand jury. Here, on the 16th of August, 1954, the circumstances of the murder were laid out, and the problems of Sam's marriage to his wife Marilyn were exposed. She had called him a Jekyll and Hyde character, it was said. But most damning of all was the appearance of Susan Hayes, the woman prosecutors claimed was Sheppard's lover. She admitted the fact that for almost 3 years she had been in an intense sexual relationship with Sam, their encounters chiefly occurring in his car or at her apartment, and that she knew he was married. On the 17th of August, the grand jury indicted Sam Sheppard to stand his trial for the murder of his wife. The trial of Samuel Sheppard opened on the 18th of October 1954 at Cleveland before Judge Edward Blythin. It was a grand finale for a tale of sexual intrigue and murder which had been scandalously trailered in the press. A request to have the trial heard at a place distant from Cleveland was denied by Judge Blythin, as was a request to delay the trial to allow emotions and public interest to subside. The prosecution, led by John Martin, claimed that the matter laid before the jury would plainly show that the Sheppards were quarrelling because of Sam's affairs with other women, and that this was the motive for his killing his wife. The defence, under Frank Garmone and Bill Corrigan, denied their client was guilty, arguing that the couple had spent 4 happy months since learning of Marilyn's pregnancy. Dr Lester Adelson gave an account of his autopsy of Marilyn, the extent of her injuries, and the cause of her death. Fred Drenken, the first police responder to the crime scene, gave his account of his arrival at the house and his inspection of the premises. He said he found no evidence of any forced entry, no sign of a struggle in the bedroom, and there had been no sighting of prowlers or suspicious characters in the district. He also said he found Sam Sheppard's tale of his fight with a large, bushy-haired man far-fetched. Coroner Dr Sam Sheppard gave evidence concerning the blood on the left trouser leg, which appeared to show Sheppard had knelt in his wife's blood. He alluded to what he discerned as being the imprint of a medical implement on the top of the pillow, which the jury was shown. He also showed Sheppard's blood-spattered watch, which, he concluded, was thus marked as a result of his assault on his wife with the weapon, which had likewise sprayed the room with her blood. Detective Robert Schotka gave evidence of the many inconsistencies in Sheppard's statements, in which he had sometimes spoken of being attacked on the stairs, another time on the landing, and another in his wife's room. A great deal of somewhat ambiguous forensic evidence was heard too, none of which was conclusive or amounted to much. A thumbprint found on the bedhead, for instance, was indisputably Sam's, but as the defence pointed out, it could have been left there at any time. Blood type evidence, too, was largely inconclusive, and leaned a little too heavily on probabilities. Then Susan Hayes was called to the stand. She admitted to the affair with Sheppard and said Sam had told her he would divorce his wife. After which the state rested its case. It had, it believed, shown a consistent and consequential stream of facts whose motive was plain for a reasonable jury to see. The defence called medical experts to prove Sheppard's own injuries were serious, including his brother, Dr Stephen Sheppard, who said solemnly that when he had seen his brother on the morning of the 4th of July, he kept blacking out. The medical community were out in force to testify to the realness of Sheppard's injuries, to a fracture in his vertebrae detected by one X-ray taken, and swelling at the base of the skull. Corrigan hoped this would be sufficient to convince jurors that his client had indeed grappled with a bushy-haired assailant at the house and on the beach that night, and had received his injuries because of this. It was a calculated risk. There was every possibility that the jury might conclude that his injuries were sustained as a result of a fight with his wife. After all, his injuries were unaccountably of a quite different character than hers. But the main witness for the defence was Sam Sheppard himself, and once again he proved to be a poor one. He was called to the stand on the 9th of December and was grilled for 3 days. It was at once apparent that he had no ability to win over the jury, the ultimate arbiters of his fate. He was remote, arrogant, unapologetic. He denied his relationship with Marilyn had been a poor one. It had been fairly happy, he said, and they had never broached the subject of divorce, denying Susan Hayes' assertion that he had done so. His affair with Susan Hayes had been, he said, merely physical. His main fault was his manner, the curious, detached way he had of describing events and people. His wife was in a bad way, was his impression. His wife had been murdered in an horrific way. His 7-year-old son was sleeping next door, and yet his description of events did not correspond in any way with the magnitude of this experience. Cross-examined by Mahan, he now admitted to sexual relations with other women, to having kissed a female patient in the car park, but he denied that his injuries were caused by his falling off the steps from the house to the beach, following his beating Marilyn to death. The final address to the jury by the prosecution paraded the absurdity of Sheppard's account, that this large, fit, athletic man could have been so easily subdued by an adversary, who had, by contrast, previously delivered some 35 blows to Marilyn. The defence, for its part, pointed out that the prosecution had failed to deliver any proof of how the crime was committed or why, and they had not even discovered the weapon used. The judge dispatched the jury on Friday the 17th of December to consider their verdict. It was Tuesday the 21st of December when they returned it. They declared their verdict as not guilty of murder in the first degree, but guilty of murder in the second degree. In other words, it was their view that this was not a premeditated murder, but one committed as a result of a domestic row. Judge Blythen sentenced Sheppard to life imprisonment, with eligibility for parole after 10 years. Here was the end of the trial, but not of the litigation. Sam Sheppard was destined to spend the next 10 years in a maximum security jail in Columbus, Ohio. It was a tragedy for the family. His mother committed suicide 3 weeks after the trial, and his father died a week after this from cancer. But the family did not give up. They employed investigators in subsequent years to uncover new evidence, find new witnesses, new suspects. It became a cause célèbre. There is never a lack in the ingenuity and resourcefulness of human beings when presented with a challenging puzzle. A busy local petty thief, Richard Ebeling, was arrested for theft 5 years later, in November 1959, and a search of his home revealed, amongst a treasure trove of other items, a ring which had belonged to Marilyn. It had been stolen from Sheppard's brother's house a year after the murder, but as Ebeling had also been the Sheppard's window cleaner, it aroused suspicions. He was questioned and took a polygraph test and cleared of deception. Since then, Ebeling has been a perennial favourite amongst investigators, chiefly because he subsequently went on to kill a woman in the 1980s. But although Ebeling admitted to the 1980s murder, he was quite adamant that he had no knowledge whatever of the murder of Marilyn, nor did he match Sheppard's description of the bushy-haired man in any way. Mayor Hook's wife, Esther, was cited by Sheppard's legal representatives as a possible suspect, apparently on the grounds that her husband had been seen having coffee with Marilyn. Could she, or they, Ebeling, or another person entirely, have done it? It's possible, but only in the remote way that it is possible for a few dozen other people to have committed the crime. Bay Village was, and is, a small village where everyone knew each other. Marilyn was an attractive woman. She was pregnant. Any man with a wandering eye, any person known to have taken drugs, any petty thief, anyone with violent tendencies, or anyone seen with, or whose wife may have been pursued by Sam Sheppard, could, in theory, be a suspect. In such a way, the population of much of Bay Village and beyond could be proposed as suspects. There is no shortage of theories may be generated either, except we are indulging ourselves in giving such theories headroom, because in doing so we lose sight of the fact that a more obvious one may fit perfectly well. Ultimately, the many appeals and legal avenues pursued by Sheppard and his legal team resulted in the district court ordering his release on the basis that newspaper reporting had made it difficult for him to receive a fair trial. The state of Ohio subsequently invalidated the original verdict, and a retrial was ordered. There was no acknowledgment that Sheppard was innocent, or might be supposed to be innocent, simply that he had not been given a fair trial, and this opened the possibility that the jury might have been influenced by matters other than the evidence that was heard in court. Sheppard's retrial was heard in 1966. The prosecution presented much the same case as it had 10 years earlier. But the defense had a great deal of additional material on which to draw. Times had changed since 1954. The public memory is short. A TV series, The Fugitive, about a doctor whose wife was murdered and who was wrongly convicted of her murder and was trying to find her true killer, played into a 1960s psyche which had become less trusting of authority than previous generations. It was widely believed that the series was based on Sheppard's experience. Although this was denied by the makers, it was certainly very helpful to Sheppard to be cast as the victim, a man denied justice. He was the perfect 60s anti-hero. Two major changes made in the retrial were, first, Susan Hayes was not called as a witness. Her damning testimony was not therefore heard, merely an account of it given. The motive was thus lessened. And second, the defense took the important decision not to place Sheppard on the stand. It was a wise move. His manner and improbable account, delivered in an unsympathetic way, could do him no favours. And of course, in the context of the retrial, it was a matter for the prosecution to prove not only its original case, but to overcome the plethora of new facts, opinions, and experts who had generated a whole new tier of evidence. But the most important factor in the new trial was the report and evidence of Dr. Paul Kirk, whose testimony thoroughly undermined the safety of Sheppard's original conviction. It was largely as a result of this that the 1966 trial found Sam Sheppard not guilty. It is essential to examine the findings and report of Dr. Kirk because of the role they played in Sheppard's acquittal in the 1966 trial. Shortly after Sam Sheppard began his sentence in January 1955, the family hired Dr. Kirk, a highly respected criminologist, to re-examine the crime scene and the evidence. He did so and made a thorough investigation of both the house and the crime scene photos and such evidence as was available to him. He was paid by the family to do so, but made clear that he had undertaken the work on the understanding that he would give no favour to Sheppard in his findings, but would seek only to establish the truth and reach such judgments as would square with this. The work Kirk did, given the limits of forensic technology in the 1950s, is the most thorough that has been done into that aspect of the crime. Kirk examined the trajectories of blood spatter which was liberal throughout the bedroom. He examined quantity and the likely speed and force required for the blood spots to arrive at their destinations, and sought to calculate what kind of implement dispersed these. He arrived at some conclusions which he believed were irrefutable. These were, inter alia, 1. The attack was carried out by a left-handed person. 2. The person was standing above Marilyn and had one knee on the bed at the time. 3. The weapon used was a short implement, probably a torch. 4. The purpose of the attack was initially sexual. 5. Marilyn's broken tooth could not have been caused by a blow, as the prosecution had claimed, but by her having bit her assailant and his having instinctively removed his hand or arm, which broke the tooth. 6. The blood evidence about the house did not point a finger at anyone in particular. It gave no indication as to who the assailant might have been. 7. The robbery was obviously staged, somewhat ineptly, but this did not necessarily point at Sam Sheppard. 8. Dr. Sheppard would be unlikely to tip out the contents of his medical bag because he prized these. 9. Sam Sheppard's injuries suggested his account was true. He had responded to his wife's scream and been knocked unconscious by the man. 10. His missing T-shirt did not incriminate him because if he had wished, he could have put on another one on returning to the house. Overall, Dr. Kirk's attempt to consolidate some facts about the murder is an excellent and thorough piece of work, but there are two general defects which are fatal to it. One is that in spite of his declaration that he would hold no brief for the Sheppard family in his examination, he does so most emphatically. His work is driven by a search for errors in the prosecution case, and for the truth only insofar as it corresponds with this. The second is that his detailed work reveals the danger of attempting to cross every T and dot every I. It is possible to be too rigorous. Not all things can be explained. Sometimes things happen in a random and inexplicable way, even counterintuitively so. For instance, Kirk's certainty that Marilyn had not suffered broken teeth as a result of a blow to her mouth was determined by the fact that no tooth fragments were found in her mouth, which he contended they would have been if this had occurred. It seems an incontrovertible conclusion, but it isn't. In 1998, Marilyn's body was exhumed and her skull examined using modern forensic techniques, and it was found categorically that her tooth loss was not the result of biting her assailant. It was most certainly as a result of a blow to her mouth. Dr. Kirk's conclusion here was eminently reasonable, but it was also wrong. The particular findings of Kirk, too, are driven by his desire to exonerate Sheppard. His conclusion that a staged robbery pointed to some person jealous of the Shepards rather than Sheppard himself is without any foundation. Mildly trashing the house in such an artificial way pointed only at an occupant of the house, Sam Sheppard. It served no other person's interest to set up a false robbery with all the dangers inherent in it. The left-handed identity of the attacker is a bold leap too. It is based on the position of the intruder and direction and trajectory of the strokes the attacker employed in the attack, as evidenced by the blood spatter. But it is extremely contrived in Kirk's conception. If the attacker knelt with one knee on the bed, something Kirk is probably correct in, then the right hand would be best employed in hitting her head with a weapon, since the majority of the injuries were on the right side of her head. If a left-handed person had hit her, then it would seem that they chose to deliver most of the blows in a back-handed manner. It is not impossible. Dr. Kirk explains this away by saying that they were delivered in the manner of swinging a baseball bat. It isn't convincing. The identification of the attacker being left-handed is, at best, a desire to furnish some large, incontrovertible truth that will categorically absolve Sam Sheppard, who was right-handed, from the crime. It won't do. Another bold leap of faith, in fact a logical error, is committed in Kirk's assumption that a flashlight was probably the weapon used to administer the blows to Marilyn. In stating that if a torch was used, then it would account for the style and pattern of the injuries, is not especially borne out by the injuries themselves. The assertion that a flashlight might be the weapon, of course, suggests that an intruder, who would have such a thing, was responsible for the attack. In fact, in asserting that a flashlight was the weapon, Kirk posits that which he seeks to prove. It is the presentation of an unconscious bias, the logical fallacy of begging the question. Sam's injuries to his face and his black eye and cervical C2 injury are accepted by Kirk as providing evidence that he was attacked by a third person, but the evidence of these injuries is far from conclusive. One X-ray allegedly showed signs of injury, another did not. As Sheppard's brother controlled the narrative assessment of the first X-ray, which he claimed revealed injury, this assessment was tainted. Even if the injuries existed, there is a much simpler explanation for them. one which accords with the prosecution case and which Kirk does not give any consideration to in his report. That is, that Marilyn had fought him, and in the struggle she injured him. Even the medical bag, which Kirk claims Sheppard would not have tipped over because he prized his instruments, is a specious argument, obtuse in its denial. In the circumstances, Sam would hardly balk at this, if he had, after all, just murdered his wife. And the bag was hardly trashed, nor the items in it kicked away by some maniacal thief. The upset was minimal. It had simply been tipped on its side. Dr. Kirk's evidence, admirable for its thoroughness, is beset by many problems. It sets up the obvious question: did Sam Sheppard get away with murder? Turning from Dr. Kirk's forensic work, there are many difficulties facing Sheppard. 1. To begin with, the house was, it may reasonably be assumed, locked and secure against an intruder. 3 people were in the house. 1 was a 7-year-old boy, and 1 was dead. What person, other than the surviving husband, could possibly have killed Marilyn? And what person was likely to do so? When Sam said he heard his wife scream, why did he not switch on the light as he ran up the stairs? It would have been instinctive to do so, yet he ran up in the dark and entered the room. Nor does it help his case much when he says he was attacked in the upper hallway or on the stairs. The same problem regarding his failure to switch on the light exists, and if attacked on the stairs, he would presumably have regained consciousness at the foot of the stairs, not in Marilyn's room. He is plainly fumbling around in his narrative, attempting to find explanations where no innocent ones can be found. 2. The family had a dog, Coco. It didn't bark. It was sedentary, said the family. But even so, a stranger in the house, beating the mistress of the house to death in the most savage way possible, her screaming and fighting back, the smell of blood on the air, the master knocked unconscious, the rooms turned over subsequently, and neither Coco nor the intruder seemed to mind. It wants explanation. 3. Sam Sheppard was a tall man, physically powerful, a track athlete, a baseball player, good at all sports, and he kept in trim. He had a punch bag in the basement he worked out on each day, yet he twice wrestled with a bushy-haired man and was given a hiding, he claimed. One would have expected the intruder, had he dared to enter the house, would have regretted his intrusion. 4. Why is it that having punched and beaten Marilyn to death with 35 blows in this frenzied attack, the intruder was content to land a couple of blows on Sheppard's face, giving him a low-grade black eye and possibly a single blow with some object to the spine? He left Sam, by his account, able to recover and give chase. 5. And would the intruder really delay to stage a robbery in the house? And for what possible purpose? A staged robbery is usually associated with the house occupant, for obvious reasons. Such a delay was dangerous and seemingly without purpose. 6. Where was Sam's T-shirt? He gave conflicting accounts of it. He certainly had it on as he lay asleep on the daybed, so likewise had it on when he ran up the stairs, and when he descended the stairs after recovering his consciousness and giving chase again. Yet when Mayor Hook arrived, he was bare-chested. As the T-shirt was not discovered in the house, it must have been removed outside, either on the steps or on the beach. It would be bizarre to imagine the intruder to have troubled to remove it, having just murdered Marilyn and having subdued, but not seriously injured, Sam twice now. And why would he do so? There is, in fact, only one reasonable explanation why Sam's T-shirt would be removed, and only one person who could possibly have removed it. That would be Sam Sheppard himself, because it was heavily soaked in his wife's blood. Kirk thought that as Sam had had an opportunity of putting on a new T-shirt, its absence gave the prosecution no favour. But this is wrong. Its absence is suggestive in itself. Its removal was clearly in Sam's favour, and it therefore places the onus on Sam to explain why he was not wearing it. 7. There were no signs of a struggle on the beach, but Sam was wet. The obvious implication is that he had gone into the water to wash off his wife's blood. 8. His watch, which was found in the green bag out back, had stopped at 4:15 a.m. The implication here is that Marilyn died at around 4:15, and he removed the watch, slinging it along with other random items in the garden. 9. It subsequently emerged that a neighbour told authorities there was a table lamp between the beds, which was missing and is clearly absent from the crime scene photos. Dr. Paul Kirk does not mention it, so presumably he was not aware of it. This seems to be important. Was it the weapon? A weapon then of chance rather than design? It seems highly likely to me that this was the murder weapon. 10. Sam called Hook at 5:40 a.m. It was left to Hook to call the police and ambulance and so forth. There is a neglect of the things that were most important. Sam was injured. His wife was dead. His son in the house. The police and ambulance were the priority, not the mayor. Yet from the earliest moments, Sam was intent on obtaining legal advice. Attorneys, his family were upon the scene before the coroner. All his and his family's actions were defensive. In fact, according to one policeman, obstructive. It was an unusual attitude for a man to take whose wife has been brutally murdered and himself attacked and twice knocked unconscious. As Otto Graham said, it could only have been a maniac. It was as if red paint had been splashed around the place, he said. There was no explanation possible other than its being the work of a maniac. Yet Sam's entire focus was upon protecting himself from the authorities, not seeking their help. The statements he gave were hardly intended to assist in the inquiries. He was vague, acting and speaking only on the advice of attorneys. It is scarcely believable that a man who had been through such an experience and whose wife was murdered while his son slept in the adjacent room would be so uncooperative with the police. Unless, that is, he had a compelling reason for that. His guilt. 11. Then there is the matter of delay. The autopsy result declared the time of death to be 4:30 a.m. The watch suggests 4:15. Even if we allow for error in a way favourable to Sheppard, it was 5:40 or 5:45 when he called Mayor Hook. 70 or 75 minutes in which all these events took place. Sam Sheppard was, by his own account, on the stairs at around 4:30. The struggle and any lapse of the consciousness that occurred can have lasted no more than a matter of minutes. After this he gave chase and caught the figure on the beach. Even if we allow a further 10 minutes for this struggle and a further lapse of consciousness, then we are still at only 4:50, or in any case before 5 a.m. We are left twiddling our thumbs for a further 45 to 55 minutes before Sam called Mayor Hook. When asked by Officer Drinken about this time discrepancy, Sheppard said he wandered about a bit, wondering what to do. Is this reasonable? Knowing his wife lay battered to death in the room upstairs and his son lay asleep next door, and he himself had been twice knocked unconscious, that his wife's killer might be close by even. It is absurd. We are bound to suspect that Marilyn was killed around or before 4:30 a.m., and the remainder of the time was spent by Sam staging the burglary and washing himself and his clothes down by the sea. For all of these reasons, it is reasonable to conclude, as the first jury did, that Sam Sheppard murdered his wife, Marilyn, on the 4th of July, 1954. But if this is so, what was his motive for the crime? The motive seems to me to be clear. It has its roots in the character of Sam Sheppard, and it is discernible in the events of his life in the 3 preceding years. Sam Sheppard was, Marilyn had told her friends, a Jekyll and Hyde character. Although pleasant and charming for much of the time, he had a dark side. He was an incorrigible womanizer. His wife learned of many of his affairs. She learned by some means of his attentions to Susan Hayes. A friend told of her walking out of a party where Sam was paying attention to Susan in her presence. When she knew about the affair is unclear. Sam would naturally tell her, as he told investigators, they were just good friends. But Susan Hayes confessed to the court that they had spent a week together in Southern California, and that Sam's friends and colleagues knew of the affair. It was common knowledge. Marilyn knew. Sam said the affair was purely physical. It did not detract from his relationship with his wife. This is unlikely. Susan was an attractive woman. He picked her up and drove her to work. They met in his car, her parents' home, her room, seized any opportunities they could to be together. He bought her gifts and flowers. It was inevitable that the affair would create gossip. People would find out. They did. But Sam had reached that point in a relationship where his desire for the woman overcame his fear of its becoming known. 3 years was a long time for such an affair to continue. It is difficult to imagine that an attractive 24-year-old woman like Susan Hayes would forsake boyfriends, marriage, a family, for the occasional snatched tryst with a married man who had a 7-year-old son. It couldn't last forever. Initially she would be thrilled by the excitement, the illicit affair with the handsome doctor. This would carry on for a little while, but it was inevitable that sooner or later the future would come up. In the early 1950s, her friends of the same age, their early to mid-20s, would be courting. They would be marrying. They would be having children, like Sam and Marilyn Sheppard, in fact. She would feel like a woman in the street, standing still, watching the world go by. Sam expressed his love for Susan many times, she said. He also said he wanted a divorce from his wife, but was afraid his father would disapprove. In November 1953, he told her he had asked Marilyn for a divorce. Sam would stave off the inevitable. Men are always playing for time in such things, and yet the pressure of it would mount with him, because while he tried to stay in the present, the future would be constantly sneaking up on him. He bought Susan a ring in January 1954. Susan subsequently claimed it was not an engagement ring, but any ring given by a man to a woman has significance. Marilyn was aware of his attentions to Susan. She had walked out of a party over this. Flowers would buy him time with her, as would other gifts, but it couldn't last, and his relationship with his wife inevitably deteriorated. There were rows. Marilyn told her friends of these. At some point, Sam Sheppard faced the choice that all people in his situation face. He could not have his cake and eat it. Susan was becoming restive. Sam was troubled, and we know this because he spoke to his brother Stephen about his affair. He was seeking advice. He was close to Stephen, who was just 3 years older than himself. Stephen advised him, as anyone in his situation would, he must give Susan up. He had a wife and son. Sam agreed, but it was not that easy. At some point in early 1954, Susan arrived at a decision. It had been a long time in the making, but it always comes. She reached the conclusion that Sam would never leave his wife. It was impossible for her to remain at Bayview Hospital, where they saw each other every day. She needed a clean break. She applied for a job 2,000 miles away in California, and she followed through, left her home, the place she was born, and started anew there. This occurred in early March 1954. Sam did not accept it. He visited her in California that same month, in mid-March 1954, and they spent the week together. He bought her a watch. Promises will surely have been made. But Susan wasn't buying it. She had had 3 years of it. When Sam returned to Bayview, he would be forlorn. He would sense Susan was moving on. Slow divorces of this kind are like a terminal illness. He knew she would find someone else. Perhaps she spoke of people she had met there, of new friends. He asked Marilyn for a divorce again. She refused. There were rows. He could only brood inwardly on those quiet mornings driving to work at Bayview Hospital, the passenger seat to his XK-120 empty. His visits to the lab now spoke only of her absence. Still he pressed Marilyn for a divorce. And then he received a devastating piece of news. Marilyn informed him she was pregnant. He would be a father again. She had played an ace, trumped all his moves with one. He may have tried to persuade her to terminate the pregnancy, supplied all kinds of reasons for this. If so, they fell on deaf ears. Marilyn had won. Should Susan hear of this latest news, and in a small village of several hundred people, she would. It would be the final act of severance. On the 17th of June, 2 weeks and 1 day before the attack and murder, we know that the couple told their local church pastor of the happy news. Just a few days before the murder itself, the Aherns had learned of it. The clock was ticking. Soon the news would be known by everyone. This is how things stood on the evening of the 3rd of July, 1954. There are, to my mind, 2 possibilities for the actual murder of Marilyn Sheppard. The first is that Sam killed his wife in a sudden rage following a row. The staged robbery, the intruder, the chase to the beach, and especially the failure to contrive a break-in, suggest this because they were not premeditated. They are too inept for this. They are acts undertaken in the moment, thinking in the moment, and under pressure. There are too many mistakes. The second possibility is that Sam Sheppard's purpose that night was different, that it began as something other than murder, but was quite definite in character, and it went wrong. The first possibility, that of a row precipitating murder, fits almost all the circumstances of that night and the events leading up to it. There is one aspect of Paul Kirk's report from the second trial which seems to be compelling. That is his conclusion that the purpose of the crime was sexual, at least in its inception. After all, Marilyn's pyjamas had been pulled down before she was attacked. How did he arrive at this conclusion? Because there was blood spatter on her lower half. Thus, her attacker had commenced to remove her lower pyjamas before she had resisted, as a result of which they fought, and he beat her to death. Kirk suggests that an intruder had entered the house with this sexual purpose and killed Marilyn when thwarted. But many of the foregoing objections to this apply here too. How would such an intruder enter the locked house, and would they do so with a dog in there, and with her husband presumably sleeping with her? How would he know he was not? The obvious answer is, once again, that he would not. That a far simpler and obvious solution is available to us. That is, that the husband was the assailant, and that he was responsible for pulling the pyjama bottoms down. He was Jekyll and Hyde, Marilyn said. Later his second wife would say he was a mild-mannered man, except when he was taking drugs or drinking. He had been drinking that evening. Had he been taking drugs? It is possible, but there were no routine tests undertaken in 1954 for those associated with crimes or accidents. For what it is worth, he was believed by police to be a dope fiend. His anger, his madness, the violence to which he was prone may indicate it, but in any case, they may have found another outlet that night in a sexual attack on Marilyn. That is the first possibility. The second possibility is suggested by a peculiar circumstance. That is, that the 7-year-old son, Chip, did not wake. He was groggy, confused, it was said. He knew nothing of the night, though he slept in the next room. This might simply be an outlier, an unexplained fact, because such matters do not always oblige us like a jigsaw puzzle. But this peculiarity is amplified by another strange circumstance. The dog's failure to bark, to wake, or show the least sign of inquisitiveness at a robbery, at the most violent murder imaginable, and an attack on his master and mistress. It is impossible to know with any degree of certainty, but it is possible to propose a theory that accounts for these circumstances. That is, that they were drugged. If so, Sam did not want his son to wake up that night, nor the dog, so he drugged both. The only person who was able to drug both, who would have the means of doing so, and the knowledge required, was Dr Sam Sheppard. That would, of course, imply premeditation to some aspect of the crime, and yet the very inadequacy of the circumstances seemed to deny any premeditation. Why, then, would the son and dog be drugged? I think it is possible that Sam Sheppard's true intention that night, one which was premeditated, was to terminate his wife's pregnancy, and it led to an unintended consequence: murder. Sam Gerber claimed to discern the bloody imprint of a claw-like medical instrument in the folds of the pillow. He didn't name the instrument, but this suggests to me that he, a medical man himself, was groping in the dark for this explanation, although he never explicitly stated it. This is the way his mind was running, though, because what possible reason could Sam Sheppard have had for choosing a medical instrument as a weapon in preference to a more suitable one, a poker, for instance? Gerber was, I believe, wrong in his assumption that a medical implement was the weapon used, but his reasoning for believing this were not. He had clear in his own mind, though he did not express it, how could he, what business Dr Sam Sheppard was about that night. If this is so, it offers a terrible new perspective on the murder of Marilyn Sheppard. That is, that Sam planned to terminate his wife's pregnancy that night, not to kill her, and drugged those who might foil his plan: his son, the dog Coco, and his wife too. Unfortunately, the autopsy report is silent upon the matter of any drugs in Marilyn's body, so we cannot know whether she was drugged. This can never go beyond speculation, a theory which has the merit of fitting all the facts of the case, not a proof. But if true, it provided Sam with the perfect riposte to his wife's apparent winning move, becoming pregnant. It was the way he could restore his future with Susan Hayes. If this is indeed what occurred, then Marilyn awoke. It would be difficult to judge the correct amount of morphine or other drug used. His intention was to sedate her, not to kill her. Whichever theory is correct, a row precipitating a murder, or an enforced medical procedure, it produced the same outcome. Marilyn fought him. She was herself a strong, athletic woman. She punched him, gave him facial bruises and a black eye, and he beat her repeatedly. Dr. Jekyll was Mr. Hyde tonight. She reached out for the only object within reach, the table lamp, and brought it down on his head as they wrestled. It stunned him. It now brought forth a fury. A rage was in him. He grabbed the lamp from her and beat her about the head with it. Her hands covered her face to protect it instinctively until they became limp, and her legs, drawn up on the bed, slipped through the bed end bars also, limp and lifeless. Now Sam Sheppard was breathless, his heart hammering. His wife lay dead on the bed. The enormity of what he had done could hardly be comprehended. He was covered in blood, especially his t-shirt and face and arms, which would take the brunt of the blood spatter. His trousers would be mostly protected by his position over her. He checked on his son. He had not stirred, nor had the dog, Coco. There was no intruder in the house, but there was a killer. He now went downstairs and through the house, carefully pulling out drawers and tipping his medical bag judiciously on its side. He had work to do. He collected some belongings, a cursory attempt. He was thinking as he went. He flung the bag containing a few belongings outside. He walked to the beach. He took his t-shirt off and tossed it in the water, waded out to cleanse himself of the blood, and disposed of the lamp. He was clearly not firing on all cylinders, through shock, through injury, through morphine perhaps for his pain, or drink or drugs taken earlier. His attempts to stage the burglary were unconvincing. His failure to replace his t-shirt was an error, and worst of all was his failure to show a means by which a burglar could have entered the house. A broken window, a forced door would have done it. He simply forgot. Nothing had gone to plan. His instincts now were for self-preservation. He had no interest in catching the killer because he knew who it was. That is why he called the mayor, rather than the police and an ambulance. His brother at once suspected the killing was the result of a row between husband and wife. He knew the nature of their relationship, he knew the pressures, and he knew his brother. Sam denied it, but his brother did all in his power to ensure Sam was removed from the reach of the police and authorities. He sought to control every aspect of Sam's circumstances thereafter. He took him to hospital himself, waving aside the ambulance. He supervised an X-ray and dictated its terms. He asserted that Sam was too ill to be questioned by police and hired the best attorney in town. Neither Sam nor his brother had any interest in finding his wife's killer. The reason for this is obvious. Over the years, many attempts to establish the innocence of Sam Sheppard have been made. A case in 2000 for wrongful imprisonment was brought by his son, Chip. The jury decided effectively that Sheppard had been guilty. As recently as 2017, it was claimed that DNA evidence proved conclusively Sheppard's innocence of the crime. It didn't. It was orphan DNA, whose origin and relevance to the crime could not be established. In 1954, when Sheppard was released from prison, he was regarded as being a victim of rough justice. He famously married the younger half-sister of Joseph Goebbels' wife, Ariane Johanstebens. He was restored to his medical practice. His womanizing, according to his new wife, continued. In 1968, he operated on a patient and accidentally severed an artery. The patient died. It was believed that he was drunk while operating, and he was barred from practice after this. His new wife divorced him in 1968 for his womanizing and violent conduct towards her. He decided to take up professional wrestling, billed himself as Killer Dr Sam Sheppard, reveling in his notoriety as the man who was convicted of killing his wife. In 1969, he married his manager's 20-year-old daughter. He had a serious drink and drugs problem by then, and on the 6th of April 1970, he collapsed and died of liver failure. He was 46 years old.